Welcome back to the IPS-RSIS Forum on Race and Racism in Singapore. We will now proceed to our panel discussion. To our online audience, please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A panel that appears at the bottom of your screen. The moderator of this panel is Professor Paulin Straughan from the Singapore Management University. On our panel, we have Dr. Almi Nekmat, Associate Professor from the Department of Communications and New Media at NUS, Dr. Daniel Goh, Associate Professor of Sociology at NUS, Dr. Lavanya Katiravelu, Assistant Professor from the School of Social Sciences at NTU, and Mr. Goh Sin Teck, Editor at Lianhe Zaobao. Prof. Straughan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And it's a pleasure to be here amongst the experts. I'm looking forward to learning from all of you. A lot to digest from Minister's speech. So what I'm going to do is invite my esteemed panelists to provide their take on this, and then we can enter a robust discussion with you, the audience. We'll start with Almi. Almi is a CNM expert. So clearly the role of social media and digital platforms is a big factor in the race discourse. So, Almi, what are your thoughts, and how do you think we should move forward on this very important discourse?
Well, a couple of thoughts actually, but I'll just would like to maybe pick up on 2 points that Minister has mentioned, and just share my thoughts before I go on to explaining about social media or sharing my thoughts on how social media kind of affects race relations or race discussions. Personally, I think it's an interesting thought, and I totally agree with the Minister when he mentioned that the majority race should take extra steps to be more thoughtful to the minority race, and I think that's important. And therein lies this very sensitive and delicate balance. How much of an extra thought or how much of a niceties should you give to the minority race before the minority race feels that it's a form of microaggression? Like, for example, if you're too nice, you might come off minority, or why are you being too nice to me? Why can't you just treat me as equal? So I guess there's no right or wrong. It's just that it's a very delicate balance when it comes to race discussions, and you do not know where's the boundary where you cross over to the race or the minority race becoming, in a sense, offended. So that's one point. So that kinds of precede my discussion here. That is going to be very, it's going to be a fine balance, and I proceed to my next point. And my next point is I pick up from what Minister has mentioned also about who shouts the loudest. Do not let it be about who shouts the loudest. And I think that is the situation that we are experiencing basically in social media. Who shouts the loudest, not in terms of the number of, not in terms of really producing quality points or really producing quality arguments, but who shouts the loudest in the sense of which discussion chambers you are in. And in your own discussion chamber, you would feel that the voice of whatever chambers you are in is presumably the loudest voiced. So again, the subjectiveness of loudness and how loud it is, it's very much dependent on the networks that you are in and what have you. So I think those are the 2 points that I just want to share at this point on what our Minister has mentioned. And perhaps as we go on later, I can share more on
Thank you, Almi. Yeah. Thank you. If I may move on to Daniel. Daniel, you have worked on race relations for a long time as a sociologist. What is your response to what Minister has shared?
Well, I may be a sociologist, but I think what I really like about the Minister's speech is the amount of history, the depth of history that's in the speech. And I want to emphasize history because I think history is a really good teacher. Right? And the older generation learn a lot about racism because they came up close, personal with racism. The younger generation, we don't have that benefit of having history as a teacher. I can almost say that we are kind of like a generation that has no history. We live in prosperous boom times, and we are privileged in many ways compared to the rest of the world. So without history as a teacher, we tend to take racism, I think, for granted as something that has happened in the past, something that we hear through stories, but we don't really learn about it except for minorities because they face it, right? So minorities face their everyday life as lessons, right, in racism. But the majority don't because they take it for granted that, we are living in multiracial harmony already. Yes, we've got to cherish it, but we don't learn about racism. We don't know what is racism. So quite interestingly, I mean, in the past 2 weeks, I have friends who came up to me and asked me, so what is racism? Is this racist? Is that racist? And so on and so forth, right? We seem to lack the knowledge of racism. And I think the question that was posed by educator to minister was really good, right? Should we start introducing pedagogies, right, of anti-racism pedagogies in school to teach people, to let them know what is racism so that we can recognize it, we can identify it, then we can deal with it more effectively and to fight it more effectively. So I think that is the key thing, right? What is racism? How do we teach that to our children, teach ourselves, right? I think I belong to the younger generation without the benefit of history as a teacher. So how do we recognize it, right? Especially for the majority who don't experience it in their everyday life. Yeah.
So this is an interesting point, Daniel, because the definition of racism, we can of course pick a textbook definition, right? But I think sometimes we get so concerned, about being politically correct that we are afraid to raise questions for fear that we are accused of being racist because we call out on the differences, right? How would you suggest that we overcome this fear? So in short, a layman's working definition of what racism is.
Well, if you ask me, I mean, I've been thinking about this because of all the questions that my friends have been asking me about what is racism. Reverting to an academic, textbook kind of definition is easy. But I actually like Minister Shanmugam's definition that I think he mentioned quite recently. What is racism? Racism is when you have racial preferences, racial prejudice, racial biases, and you impose it on someone to their detriment. I think it's a very simple definition, and it's very commonsensical. And it works, right? I mean, when you make a racist joke, you are bringing out your own prejudice and you're imposing on someone to the detriment. The person gets laughed at, right? So as simple as that, you can apply this definition to, I think, almost every situation.
So clearly imposition, right?
Yes.
Is the action word there. Thank you, Daniel. Now I move to a very, very young sociologist, right? Lavanya, I'm very, very interested in your views as a younger Singaporean. So Daniel is young and you are even younger, right? Without that perspective of having, gone through what your grandparents and even your parents experienced, when Singapore was a very young nation trying to pull all the different groups together. What is your perspective on what we have seen in recent weeks and months and of what Minister has shared?
Yeah, thanks so much, Prof. Straughan. And thanks for giving me a seat at the table to contribute to the discussion. So I think, building on what Daniel said, as an ethnic minority person, I mean, I come from a lot of privilege, middle class background, university professor, of course, but having said that, I think ethnic minorities feel racism as a part of everyday life, right? And in recent weeks, we've seen examples of this type of everyday racism that we haven't seen as much of before, which I think is what is concerning. But going back to definitions of racism that you raised, right? I think I want to add on to what Daniel has said and also point to more structural institutional aspects of racism, right? And maybe ask if there are links that can be made, right, between larger institutions, which were also mentioned in the speech, and everyday forms of racism, right? Because as sociologists, we're interested in institutions. So, I'm thinking more structurally in terms of what we can do institutionally. I think schools are a great place to start, and perhaps we need to think about introducing racism, as a topic into education in schools. But at the same time, maybe we should think more institutionally about training teachers in implicit bias training, because people don't know that they might have biases, right, blind spots, and how to spot them, how to guard against them. And I think we need to think more institutionally about places like education, employment, as well as housing, all which were mentioned by the minister. And as a sociologist, for me, I think looking at things through this institutional lens is very important. Thinking how we can make changes, not just in terms of our everyday behavior, which we should, but also in terms at this institutional level that will also then, I think, feed into the ways in which we think at an individual level, right? So one of the kind of perhaps more wide-ranging suggestions would be maybe to think about having an independent race commission or a body in Singapore that serves as a central place where we can deal with these type of institutional incidences, so they don't have to go maybe directly to a principal or MOE, but maybe go through MOE or principal to an independent body that can assess, claims. So that will be one of my reactions, I think, to Minister Wong's speech, thinking about how we can take this discourse, not just at the individual level, but bring it to an institutional level as well.
I see merits in that I imagine that the body that constitutes this inquiry or membership would be people who are trained, right, to distill and then to navigate through the difficulties. But let me pick up on one point that you mentioned earlier. We put a lot of emphasis on education because we believe that this is where socialization takes place, and inadvertently we put a lot of pressure on school teachers. I wonder if that is tenable, because if you think about primary school, right, teachers have to deal with so much, and in addition to content, mastery, they have to deal with, socialization issues, making sure that the child, is well adapted to his environment or her environment, and so forth. And of course, secondary school doesn't get any easier. And then we add on race sensitivities. Do you think that can be done? There's a lot of attention being focused on one small group of professionals.
No, I think what you point out is definitely true in terms of a lot of pressure on teachers. They already have to take on so much, right? So I don't know, maybe it's not necessarily the job of the teachers. Maybe we need counselors or a different kind of pedagogical entity to implement this. But I'm thinking about the Polytechnic lecturer who made those racist remarks, and he's been now stripped of his position. But thinking about, could his attitudes have filtered into how he graded his students, right? And so should we have this type of implicit bias training and audits of the ways in which students are graded, because education is the kind of bedrock of our meritocratic society, right? And if we really want to hold meritocracy as a value, I think we need to think about how racism can infiltrate into a place like schools and destroy meritocratic standards. So that's why I think training teachers, at least, is really important.
Yeah. We'll come back to that. My friend in the hot seat, right? I'm not going to be politically correct about this. It must be very difficult being editor of Chao Pao at this point. Let me, invite you to give your take. I mean, Minister has I think, contextualized, right, the commentary from Chao Pao. Perhaps, share with us, the difficulties of being, the editor of a Chinese paper, in this season, right?
Okay. Let me first, because when I was invited to come to this panel discussion, I look at the list of my fellow panelists. I asked them, why do you invite me? I'm not an academic. I'm Chinese speaking. And they say, oh, it's important to have someone from the Chinese community, especially someone who is Chinese speaking. So, in fact, I am a kind of indeed a reluctant participant into this panel discussion. But I persuaded myself to come. But I would like to, first of all, explain where I'm coming from. Yeah, I'm quite wary to be seen as being a representative of the Chinese community, because people may try to assume that Chinese community is like it's very homogeneous, but in fact it is not. First of all, it is segmented by the language that people speak. If you look at people who are predominantly Chinese speaking and predominantly English speaking, and then you have another group who are bilingual. And because of their experience in life, their worldview, their value system, the way they look at things, way worlds apart. So I'm quite wary that whatever I say is perceived as, I'm speaking for a Chinese voice. In fact, there's no Chinese voice on any issue, let alone on such a delicate issue like race or racism. So I think we should not try to have this, like, oh, this is a typical Chinese response to this, or this is a typical Chinese position on this. In fact, you may not be able to find a typical Chinese position on a race issue. This is maybe the first thing I want to stress. Yeah, then I am the only one who doesn't have a doctor in front of my name.
But your editor, even more important.
Yes, but
editor
I thought
more
I was still calm
important.
because I thought I can share a practitioner's perspective. And I actually have one. Maybe I just share one thing first. I started off as a crime reporter, and my senior told me that, when you write a crime story, we will never start off with, or the headline, like, a Chinese was beaten up by whatever race, or that whatever race was robbed by whatever race. We will never start off a story like this. The fact could be like that. And his reason is very simple. Many of these crimes, there's no racial undertone. It is just simply an act of a person against another person. But if day in, day out, our readers were to read, somebody from this race is doing something harmful, something, to another race. Day in, day out, we are reading this headline. It gives our readers an impression that, a particular race is doing something very hurtful to another race. And it is not good. And I think this makes a lot of sense. So this principle, in fact, is passed down generation after generation, even until today. And as an editor of the newspaper, I uphold this principle. But you look at what happened in the social media. Sometimes it is the other way around. Sometimes it's just a simple act of a person against another person, but people like to bring in the race element into it. And I think this is something of a concern. I would just stop here.
Yeah, I agree with you, and that's why, if Almi doesn't mind, if we return to the role of social media, right? We talked about this briefly in our huddle yesterday, and that is, it is the space where it attracts really extreme views. Possibly because when you enter a space by choice, you feel that you're among like-minded individuals, and therefore your guard is off. That could be one, or possibly two, because you can hide behind monikers. So you feel that you can say what you want without having to face repercussions. So as a media expert, how do you manage? How can we navigate this space? Because you can't say ban social media. It's a very important platform, right? When dealing with non-contentious issues, that's the first place I go to look for information on health, medication, that kind of stuff that doesn't invite too much, a polar, kind of attributes. But in an area like race relations, it's a difficult platform to manage. What's your take on that?
Well, you are right, Paulin. And I'll just pick up from what Syntax has mentioned. And I think it really happens in social media in the same way also, in that what we call the drip effect. It's like, you just report on the story and then all the race references, race examples get added onto it. And once you are in that particular exposure over day, overnight, over time, you begin to internalize that it's kind of a normal thing that's happening, and it's always reason. That's always because of race. Unfortunately, like what you mentioned also, this is just one part of it, right? This is just one chamber of it, right? And we know that there are, like what you mentioned, I wouldn't say like extreme. It does go all the way to extreme, but before it gets extreme, it gets polarized. And then there will be the extreme examples. But eventually, if you accept the inevitability that most discussions on any particular topic will have their left and right, will have their against and to. Black lives matter, all lives matter. Me too, him too. Pink dot, where white. So eventually, it will, in a way, gets alternative voices in it, because that's the nature of the medium. So if we take that as a fundamental, right? And then we start to question then, where is the safe space? How do we create a safe space in this very polarized environment? From the ordinary individual social media user, right? These are my safe spaces. So basically, it's not about creating that one particular safe space where all of us come in. That's important, and expanding it is important, but it's very difficult in social media. Because if you were to ask me, and if I were to think on a certain manner with regard to a certain topic or certain issue, I will pick my safe space. And my safe space is within this echo chamber. And so basically what we have in social media are multiple pockets of safe spaces.
That doesn't sound good, right?
Yep, so that is in a reality, but let's be optimistic.
It will really fragment us rather than bring us together.
Exactly. So basically, in a sense, yes. So there are fragmentations, but eventually these fragmentations can all fall into two polarized views depending on the topic that you're talking about, or depending on the topic, right? Like for example, if you were to take, it especially works for, and I think you've raised that point, why don't you find this kind of scenarios happening for really objective scientific kind of topics like health or like medicines and all that. But it happens more often than not on morally loaded or controversial issues like race, like gender equality, religion, where we can actually argue in two sides. In other words, pardon my word, till the cows come home, right? You can argue this way on a very religion basis, and you go to the left or to the right, and so forth. So there's no right or wrong, and that's when polarization happens, and that's when people start to pick their safe spaces within these chambers.
Let me apologize to our audience. Just give me one latitude of one more question before I go to yours, okay? And that is this notion of a common space where we can demystify the social construct race, right? Where we could lift our, fears and concerns and barriers and come together so that we can curate a moderated common ground, a common ground that is, not polarized. Where can that space be? If I don't want to misrepresent you, but it sounds like it's very difficult on social media.
Can I just give a take on where's this common ground?
Okay.
Or at least my thoughts on
Sure.
Has to be, at least in my opinion, it has to be beyond just social media. It has to be in real settings also, or a hybrid kind of version. Because we know, right, in order to have a bigger common space or bigger safe space, we need to be inclusive. And the voice that's always missed out on social media are the voice of the older generations, for instance, right? So when we look at all these voices on social media, we are actually lacking the view of what do this, history. We are losing history, right? We are losing the voice of the older generations. So it's really not a very comprehensive or even a safe or even a space to begin with in that sense. So then the question then, how do we bring the older generation voice into this space? Definitely not only on social media. It definitely has to be in a real life or kind of a hybrid setting. Yeah.
So then, Vanya.
Yeah, sorry, could I jump in? Just kind of responding to what was said earlier, right, about choosing safe spaces. And I think before perhaps we talk about, inclusive safe spaces, which are absolutely necessary, one thing we need to acknowledge is that for some people who have experienced racism, who are marginalized, it's really important to have those closed, in some ways, safe spaces in order to articulate their experiences, because a lot of ethnic minorities feel like in more inclusive spaces or more open spaces that their experiences are questioned, gaslighted, diminished. So I think there is, even though these spaces might seem polarizing, I think there is a space for them because people need their experiences validated, acknowledged, and I feel it's therapeutic, but it's also necessary to find a community who validates your own experiences. And I think, so we shouldn't dismiss these spaces that are exclusive or self-selected completely and say, no, we only want open spaces, but I think we need both, right? So
I
just
agree.
needed to add that.
Daniel first, and then Cynthia.
Well, I don't think we're doing too bad. I mean, there's some interesting pages like Minority Voices and Lepak Conversations, which I enjoy reading, and I follow them. And I think these are the kind of spaces where they start out as safe spaces and then they open up, right? And I think that courageous move of opening up to show the majority, right? That, hey, these things are happening. Don't forget it, right? Is really important. And so therefore, in some ways, they become hybrid, right? They are safe spaces in which minority members can talk about their experiences, share and get support. But they're also public-facing in some ways, so that the majority can also listen, understand and learn. And I would think that what Naomi was saying about hybrid spaces, right, in which you have institutions that would normally not be on social media. Maybe the IRCCs, right, the Interracial and Religious Confidence Circles, the IRO, where the older generation are participating in it, and many other institutions. I would even think like museums and cultural organizations who don't usually touch on issues of racism. They could come in, they could organize forums, they could organize workshops, roundtables, and it could be hybrid like this, where you have a group of people sitting around talking about these things, a round table, but it's also public facing, it is also on social media so that young people can learn about it, can join the discussion, can ask questions. And I think more of these spaces have to be, fostered, and we shouldn't depend always, right, on the government to initiate and to do everything, right?
Yeah,
it's civil society, right?
Yeah.
Civil society should be doing this.
So herein lies the difficulty. I think many are afraid to touch the difficult topics, right? Race and religion. So I think moving forward, we really need to empower those who want to and who can to host open sessions where we can discuss and demystify, right? So that we don't trip over ourselves because we don't know, right? I'm sorry, Cynthia, please.
As an editor, I would say even the traditional media has a role and has a responsibility in creating this space as well. And we actually provide such a platform for people with different opinion and views to exchange. So sometimes I find it quite strange, that people are saying, why are you publishing this piece of opinion? Or
Cynthia, I have to tell you, I've been trying to avoid this question, but it wouldn't leave the top of my screen.
Yeah.
And it reads, why does Jiao Bao continue to publish opinions that stroke racist sentiments and so forth? Please go on.
I think, first of all, we have to start discussing about race issues. I think I share the view that, if we don't, that there's risk of discussing it openly, because then you get people excited and things like that. So there's risk. But there's also risk of not discussing it, and then you try to be quiet, don't talk about it, and then something major happen, and then it may just explode. So both sides have risk. So I think we should start talking about this. And when we start talking about this, it is inevitable that then you have people from different different school of thoughts, different opinions to come out. And then we have to accept that there are people who don't actually share my view. And we have to start to learn how to also, not only that to stress that I have the right to say what I want to say, but I should also open my heart and my ears to also listen to people who have different views from me. And I thought the newspaper can provide such a platform. But we are careful that when we publish such pieces, we are always careful to look at the language. When I say language, look at the tone, whether it is sincere in wanting to discuss, or it is trying, as well as say, to stroke emotion.
So herein lies the difficulty, right? Zhao Bao is a Chinese medium paper, and the Chinese language is a beautiful language, right? The problem is the minority members and many, who cannot read Chinese would have to rely on a translation. And then something gets lost. How can Zhao Bao protect itself to prevent this from happening? Can you do your own translations?
It takes a lot of resources, I would say, but actually we are looking into this seriously. For important pieces, rather than leave it to somebody to translate. Worse still, people not only translate and then they will put in their interpretation and say, oh, this is what this article is trying to imply. And this becomes the interpretation of the article. Then sometimes the discussion get lost.
Agree. I totally agree. Thank you very much for engaging with us on that. Let me move on to the next question. Minister mentioned several times that racial preferences are human nature. And they want the sociologists to comment on this.
So what are you looking at me for? I don't think he said human nature. I think he said that there's something instinctual about it. And the question is where this instinct comes from. It's hard to put a percentage to it, like whether it's 50% human nature or 50% socialization. But I would say as a sociologist that a lot of it is learned at home, right, through socialization. Then after that in the playground, in schools. And that's why education is really important. I know there's a lot of stress, a lot of pressure on teachers and whatnot, but if this is an existential issue, we have to do it in the school. And we have to start young because these things get fostered at a very young age. Whether it is a non-racist kind of attitude towards friendships or a more racial kind of putting on racial lenses, it is learned at a very young age, right? There have been some studies that actually show that children at a very young age do not recognize races. It is then learned, and after that it becomes instinct. So that's where I think we need to intervene in the schools at a very young age, maybe in the preschool, at the preschool level.
So you're not talking about the appreciation of differentiation, because that's not racism, right?
Yeah.
Just curious about different skin tones, where people come from, different cultures, lines. It is about that when you have a value differentiation, right? And that clearly, of course, is learned behavior. So here I'm trying to dissect the question because I think the question is fairly loaded. The fact that children and human beings, right? There's certain we lean towards certain preferences at different seasons, right? For example, when K-pop is still hot, but when it first came on, all my friends wanted to whiten their faces so that they can look like the beautiful Korean actresses. Okay, and so the seasons come, seasons go, and popular culture does, influence a lot, and that is not necessarily dangerous.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe I could add on. I mean, I don't think that acknowledging differences, saying someone is different, or acknowledging, their culture is different, their religion is different, is a problem. And in fact, I think what Minister Wong was saying is that we should appreciate that, right? And our diversity is built on the appreciation of difference. But I think what is important is to emphasize, even though we are different, we must be treated equally. There must be equality, right? And that's what we all want. So I don't think the creation of boundaries, or whether it's normal or learned, or probably a bit of both, as Daniel said, is a problem. But I think it's making sure that those boundaries don't make sure that one person is treated better than the other based on gender or religion or race, right? So, because there's a lot of literature on boundary making in sociology, and we see that there are ways in which those boundaries become problems when there is no equitable distribution of resources, and when it's not a problem, when there is more equality between groups, right? So I think what we should be pushing for is not a dissolution of boundaries or a non-acknowledgement of difference, but really of ensuring equality, right? Which is, I think, something we can all agree on.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
definitely. Elmi, you want to weigh in on this?
On the question of whether racism is actually socialized.
The answer is yes, lah.
The answer is yes, it is socialized. Yeah.
So therefore,
It is socially constructed,
maybe
yeah.
sociology should be a compulsory subject.
But I would like to approach it from the view of the media and how you're socialized now. Yes, primarily in the family, but how the media is actually embedded in the family itself at a very young age, to the point where even the parents and the kids are actually exposed to social media, and how they get information and how they consume popular culture through social media, and how they view other people, other races through short nuggets of information and visual portrayals, such as in
No,
TikTok
you're
and everything
spot
else.
on. That's right. It's
Yeah.
that filtering that has to happen. Parents have responsibilities. Let's face it. Yeah,
Exactly.
we can't pass the buck to teachers and people outside the school. So children pick up quite a bit just through observation, and of course now with the with the iPad, it almost being a toy for every other child, and the access to short clips and so forth. I do think that parents do need to screen.
So let me just give you an example. I would say that even socialization now, especially in the recent COVID-19 situation where kids are now not in school and they're doing their home-based learning, that in fact socialization among kids still happen, but it happened through the medium. Like for example, like when I have kids of my own, so I have this. I'll just briefly share my situation that I had with my wife. So she was like,
Is your
okay,
wife listening?
I hope not.
Okay.
So she was like, okay, it's about time that our kids they want to play Roblox or this game called Roblox. And I said, okay, it's not time yet. They're in primary school. No, it's so important because they have not met their friends for a long time, and that is where they chat with their friends. So a game or a medium is no longer just a one-way kind of consumption of information. It becomes a very strong socialization tool, and they play or they communicate on these platforms. And that's where a lot of, if you may, racial undertones or values gets transmitted. So, so personally coming from a media perspective, it's actually embedded in the media itself. Yep.
I'm showing
so I
my
said
age.
yes.
I don't know what roadblock is. I'm just nodding, since everybody seems to know what it is. But I get you. I get you. Okay.
Yes, thanks for it.
There's a question here directed to the two sociologists on your thoughts on Chinese privilege. But maybe let me broaden that a bit. Let me just ask all of us here. We borrow a lot of labels from elsewhere in the world, right? Black Lives Matter, Me Too, white privilege. What's the danger importing this, and then just changing the label to suit our needs? Because something like Black Lives Matters, for example, has a deep historical, meanings in the United States. I find it, from a distance, very strange that we should, bring it lock, stock, barrel, and then plant it and start expect that it should be able to, we should be able to ride on it, right? So maybe your thoughts on bringing these labels in and the caution, if any, we should apply?
Okay, I can go first. I think, there's obviously historical context to labels and terms. But this is not something new, right? We've always been borrowing language from other contexts because we're speaking English, which is not a kind of native language to this part of the world. So, for instance, meritocracy is a concept, an idea, a value that is not local. It's something that's imported. Originally, the term came up in the UK, but yet we've adopted this, right? And we've contextualized it, saying, we will implement meritocracy according to these particular local standards, right? Ensuring equality in schools in this way by providing mother tongues, for example. So similarly, I think when we think about the notion of privilege, right, we need to acknowledge that it comes from a different context in the US, but how can we localize it, and is it relevant for the local context? And I think Daniel's written about this, and I'm also something is in review along these lines as well. So, but I think it has resonated amongst young people here because people are struggling for a language to talk about social reality, and so these ideas or these concepts are useful to express particular feelings, particular social realities, but I think we should acknowledge that they imply a very different reality in Singapore, but they might be useful still to articulate and acknowledge hierarchies, differences, inequalities.
Daniel?
Yeah.
Well, history matters again. So we have been borrowing, using a lot of these borrowed terms because we are a very connected, globalized city with a very cosmopolitan population. We consume a lot of media from all over the world. If you are talking about how it has really formed us materially, the phrase garden city, for example, came from a British urban planner. And he has become core to our very identity as a city, right? So imported terms are important. They are in fact central, I think, to our formation of our own identity as Singaporeans. We borrow a lot, we adapt a lot, but I think the key thing is that we adapt. And my objection to the term Chinese privilege when it appears in academic setting is that we are not adapting it enough. We are borrowing it, and without contextualizing it, and without putting it in proper kind of institutional kind of perspective. And I want to emphasize that it is institutional because privilege exists in institutions. They don't exist independently of institutions. All right? And so when we talk about Chinese privilege and we want to criticize any form of privilege, whether it's class privilege, sexual identity privilege, whatever privilege, we have to talk about the institutions that we are trying to provide a critique of. And that is very important. We need to contextualize. To use it as a blanket term will be to revert to the same kind of racism and racialization that we do not want to happen, which is to say that, okay, 75% of the population, you have privilege, you don't realize it, you're complicit in racism. Right? It puts everyone into a defensive posture. It cuts conversations off, right? So it's better to start off with experiences, whether it's in institutions or whether it is in everyday life. This is my experience of a racism, of an incident of racism. Don't start pointing fingers at each other's skin color and say that this privilege, that privilege, or that, that you, and so on and so forth. Let's open up the space for conversations and for discussion. The question of privilege is important, right? And it has to be discussed. And I think a lot of Chinese individuals, Chinese Singaporean individuals, and Chinese Singaporean institutions are already starting such conversations, whether internally or starting, externally in their own capacity in blogs and so on and so forth. And that's where the adaptation will happen, right? So I think we also need to be humble, to have a certain humility as scholars, as sociologists, that although we are often tagged with the term experts, we do not pronounce truths. We are participants in the truth making, right? And we have a social responsibility to be careful with the terms we use and not to valorize it and make it into such a truth term that if you cite me, for example, and therefore I'm the authority on it, and therefore it is true. Yeah, it cannot be like that. So we have to be humble also as scholars.
And I think that's a very important point. Of course, the media plays a very important role because the media, many people don't read, the journal articles we publish, but they certainly read the papers, right? So, and I think that Syntax also, as Minister had pointed out, the notion of being Chinese is a very diverse group of us, right? Would you like to weigh in on it?
Yes. So I'm glad that even among the sociologists, you actually see a concern of borrowing foreign terms and then try to apply it wholesale in Singapore. And in fact, this is also our position, that because in your academic context, you know what do you mean when you say Chinese privilege? And of course, this Chinese privilege is borrowed from, because of the white privilege, then you apply it in Singapore, and then since Chinese is the majority here in Singapore, so you have the Chinese privilege. In an academic context, you know what you actually mean. But especially to the Chinese-speaking Chinese, predominantly Chinese-speaking Chinese, all this while, because of their language inadequacy in English, they face frustration, they face marginalization and things like that. They don't come and complain that say they are being discriminated. And now then suddenly they come across this term, Chinese privilege. Then they say, what privilege do I have? And then instead of forging understanding, in fact, we are dividing people. So I don't think it is helpful in this sense. Huh?
Yeah, I get you.
And, yeah. So, and I feel for this group of people. I actually feel, and worse still, when they come out and say, I do not have Chinese privilege, then people who are not predominantly Chinese speaking, they then interpret it in an academic context and say, oh, you are denying that actually there is racism and there's racial discrimination exists in Singapore. This is not what they mean when they say there's no Chinese privilege. This is not what they mean. They are just saying that as a Chinese-speaking individual, I enjoy any privilege at all. But then people then misunderstand and say, oh, you're trying to deny that there's advantage for the Chinese as a whole.
No, I think
then misunderstanding is become even deeper.
Yes.
And this is the concern. Yeah.
Yes, certainly. I think Syntax has reminded us that for the Chinese-speaking subgroup, they've gone through a difficult time with the progress of Singapore. Very few younger Singaporeans, they tend to be able to, are more comfortable speaking English, right? And of course, this group is also older. Yeah.
They used to be the silent majority.
Yeah.
They are still silent, but they are no longer majority. And
yes. So precisely, right? We need conversations like these so that we can distill the misunderstandings and clarify, the very complex thoughts, that go into simple statements. Because race relations is very hard to articulate, particularly if you're trying to talk about lived experiences, right? So how can we continue to encourage this? So hold that in mind, because I'm going to ask you that as the last question, okay? Like, what can we do to advance our multiculturalism moving forward? But let me go back to the audience before they lock us off. Say these five are talking among themselves. We're going to just go home now. Okay. I have a question here because Minister had talked about, he had talked about three things, right? Role of majority, very broadly, the importance of mutual accommodation, trust, and compromise. And then he also touched on the role of government and policies. So here is a question on a policy. Are we ready for a Race Discrimination Act, which should deal with discrimination at, why like that? The thing jumped already. Yeah, I tell you, okay, you guys are playing tricks on me. Okay, question disappeared, sorry. Okay, so let me go on to another question here. As a sociologist, we acknowledge that there is persistence of racial hierarchy in Singapore. No, the question is, as a sociologist, the question is to the sociologist, can we acknowledge that there is a persistence of racial hierarchy in Singapore. And the question remains, what can we do as Singaporeans to overcome this to the benefit of all of us? So there's a ranking of skin colors.
Is there?
I don't know. I mean, I think the question is there, right? First of all, is there? And if there is, then what should we do about it? But is there?
I think it's coded in our public affairs and institutional affairs that we cannot have that racial hierarchy. But nevertheless, right, and this is the IPS racial and onepeople.sg surveys on racial harmony. We have a large number of ethnic minorities who say they face discrimination in employment, right, in hiring.
Yes.
73%, I think, for Malays, and 68% for Indians. This is huge. This is a large number, right, compared to 38% for the Chinese. So there is institutional issues here, right? It's institutional in the sense that there are widespread practices, right, in which prejudices, preferences get imposed on individuals to their detriment. And widespread enough to make it an institutional issue because you have a lot of people experiencing the thing. So that even if you have employers who are not thinking racially or racist personally, they might do racist actions by denying ethnic minorities position because they feel that their customers or clients would want some kind of ethnic preference, right? So that's institutional racism that we're talking about. So we have to deal with that, and we have to study the issue. We have to deal with that. Whether it should be legislated, I mean, that's another question altogether. Whether it's effective, right? But we have to talk about this, and we have to deal with it.
Yeah, that's a very difficult situation, isn't it? If you're a business owner and you're dealing with a clientele, and it is about profit margins, what can you do though?
That's why it's institutional racism. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a question of how then should the government of the day intervene in such a way as to effectively remove that discrimination, which is important, right? Yeah.
I think the same thing happens in housing as well, and I think the minister also talked about this. There's also discrimination in housing, and I think the hierarchies can shift according to different spheres as well. So it's not always Chinese Singaporeans who are going to be on top or Chinese who are going to be on top. So in the hiring market, for instance, we've seen evidence of Chinese migrants being discriminated, as well as some Muslim people being discriminated, as well as, of course, Indian people being discriminated. So I think it depends on where, which sphere. So there might be different hierarchies, and of course, there's a lot of there are people calling out kind of in-network hiring by migrants, for example, that might privilege migrants and not Singaporeans. So the hierarchies might shift according to different realms. And I think we need to acknowledge that as well.
So there's a question here again on housing, though Minister had already touched on it. But do panel members have additional thought on the racial quotas in housing? Particularly, I think the concern is on the resale market, right? So Chua Hong has a nice piece in the papers today, and she talked about how HDB flats should not be used to monetize. Right? Should not be allowed to be used to monetize. Do you think that would resolve the issue?
I think you need a new panel to discuss that. It's a huge issue. I mean,
this is a really difficult question, right? Because we want to, ensure that we don't create ethnic enclaves, that we do maintain a kind of diverse living environment, because there's so many positives in that. But at the same time, there's some inbuilt kind of institutional negatives, right, for ethnic minorities. So how can we balance it out? And this is a difficult question, I think. But and the monetization debate has been going on for a long time, right? Not just in terms of minority issues, but generally in terms of this is a public welfare good. Should we be using this for profit? So I think it goes beyond issues of race, perhaps. Yeah,
but you are right in that the quotas, there are strong benefits to them, because I grew up in HDB, in the old HDB flat blocks, right? And on every well, maybe not every floor, but certainly in the block, right? On my floor, on my parents' floor, there was a Malay family, there was an Indian family. And just because they were there, and because, you know, they're still there now, right? So they've lived there like for 20, 30, 40 years. They just become friends, and the race identity just drops off, right? And they just become, you know, a neighbor. They know by friend, you know, by name. They share festivals, you know, they share food and all that. But maybe it's very ideal because these are the older estates where the owners don't look to monetize, right? They just want to stay put. Very different from the newer estates where stay 5 years and then quickly sell off to make a huge profit. So you're right in that maybe another panel should do this, but it's certainly an important topic.
But because you shared your experience, right, Paulin, and I will just share my experience also. So I just purchased a HDB flat, and the main consideration for me purchasing that particular flat is that my first neighbor was an Indian. My next door neighbor was a Chinese, and I feel that there just should be a Malay, you know, buying. So it just competes, and that's how I've grown up with. And you know, it's because how we have always seen each other. And I guess, well, personally, I'm just sharing the personal experience. So it kind of works in that way. It builds the Singaporean identity, I think.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
I think we need some tweaking of this as well, because recent research by Leong Chan Hoon, he's at SUSS, has shown there's more ethnic clustering happening across different estates in Singapore, and especially in the more sought after estates in the central areas, there are less ethnic minorities. So again, maybe this needs to be looked at a macro level. Yeah.
There's a question here. Following up on what Daniel had raised, Daniel has raised an important point about the majority youth having not experienced racism as compared to the minority youth. Do you remember raising that?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is known as majority privilege, and it's important to be aware of or acknowledge this situation so that changes can be made to address this matter.
This is what I like to say when it comes to like not experiencing racism. That is a right. It's a constitutional right. It's not a privilege. So reverse it. We should make sure that the minorities, their rights are
also
respected.
do not
and exercised.
experience
Yes, exactly.
racism. That's right. That's right.
And the
Spot on.
majority has a responsibility to make sure that right is respected.
Yes. So here comes, you know, the difficult thing, right? It comes back to having that conversation, because especially when we're dealing with youths and young children, they may not even know that it is an expression that is racist or an act that is racist, right? How do we start them off young? I know you're going to talk about teachers again, but besides teachers, can we exercise some social imagination here? What else can we do to start our young Singaporeans off on the right foot?
Well, maybe I'll suggest not so much teachers, but I think the teachers should be resourced to be able to teach these things. And MOE has kindergartens now. So MOE, has the resources, I think, to prepare kind of teacher kits, anti-racism kits that could teach young children how to identify and how to learn how not to be racist. I think that's an important thing. And look at our, I'm sure we're kind of familiar with home-based learning, tools and so on and so forth. It's actually quite good, the production. I mean, my son is learning a lot about the environment, about littering and so on and so forth. But I want him to learn about issues of racism and multiracial harmony and diversity.
Yeah, interactive platforms. As this is where social media, can be used in a positive manner, where carefully curated content to explain, the difference between asking a question of curiosity and asking a question of hurt, right? Good, thank you. Then there's a question on the Singapore identity. The question is the Singapore identity and culture subjective? If yes, may I ask how these two should be defined amid rising short-term, long-term immigration? Should the Singapore characteristics be tangible or abstract? Would the subjective interpretation be helpful or harmful for Singapore? 14 people voted on this. I hope they all understood the question because I got lost reading it out. Let me try again. Okay. So I think essentially, since we're talking about, race and ethnic relations and so forth, so ultimately, it points down to what is the Singapore identity, right? Minister talked about, like growing, like trees, growing deep roots, but at the same time, cross-fertilizing at the top. So in the midst of all these concerns about race and race relations and the narrative, right? How do we control this narrative so that it will drive us, meaningfully towards the curation of a unique Singapore identity? So the narrative on race, very frankly, is very random, right? Because it depends on what the headlines are, and then suddenly everybody's talking about that. And then another, dramatic situation arises, and then this will be forgotten already, okay? But I think, given that, the Singapore identity hinges so much on our multiculturalism, surely we cannot allow, the narrative on race to be so randomly dictated. So how should we frame this narrative? How should we drive it so that we can concurrently do that? Grow deeper appreciation of our respective, ethnic identities, but at the same time, make that connection, not just to be cautious about how we interact with each other, and avoid, sticky situations, but actually progressively, start to link things together so that we can form that core Singapore identity.
So could I start off, Paulin? I think I don't think we can control the conversation actually, and I our social media expert may. Maybe back me up on this, but I don't think we can control social media discourse. I don't think we can control what people say or people think, right? And I don't think that's really what we should be trying to do. I think what we should be trying to do is ensure people treat each other well, equally, with respect. And I think we need strong indications, institutions, policies and laws, right? That's what we can do. We cannot police thought, but we can police actions, how people treat each other. So I would say that we need to build stronger institutions, whether it's schools, whether it is laws that prosecute people who discriminate unfairly in workplaces, for example, hiring decisions. So for me, I think that's the way to build a stronger national identity that invests in multiculturalism and multiracialism through institutions and through strong policies and laws, right, that support this multicultural framework.
Yeah. How come the rest so quiet?
Well, I think the analogy of the trees is from Ko Pa Kun, right? And if you want to use the same analogy back, we are a forest ecosystem, right, to put it that way. And the kind of multiracialism, interlinkages in the foliage is providing us the canopy, right, the forest canopy. Of course, there will be incidents, there will be racist incidents and whatnot, and we will bounce back from that. And we do bounce back from that because I think we have already established this ecosystem and it's working, right? It's working. So that you have the kind of resilient responses from different communities, but at the same time, now, and for me, I see the level of discourse in social media, which some may say is it's too polarizing. Perhaps they're uncomfortable with the level of discussions and debates and so on. But we tend to revert to the mean, and I think the mean for us is quite established. And this forum and the excellent speech by Minister already shows. The mean is there. Right? We do revert to the mean, and then the conversations continue, and then the next incident will happen, and then a new set of conversations will happen. I was just looking through the newspapers the other day. 2 years ago, after the brown face Nets ad, right? There was.
Has it been 2 years?
Yeah, it's been 2 years.
Oh my gosh.
That was in I think August, July 2019, before the pandemic, and there was after that a onepeople.sg forum, in which there was very frank discussion about the same issues that we are having here, right? So we are having this over and over again. I think this is going to be a repeat, and these incidents will grow, we will learn from it, and I think that is, if there's anything, that's the Singaporean identity, the Singapore spirit. right? Which is that we always we always learn. We're open. We're open to the world, and we keep learning from it.
Yeah. So, wait,
If I would just pick up from what Daniel has mentioned, I think it's important. I think it's the importance of not being complacent and to continuously learn. And that's what I think should be happening in at least social media. I think the problem with social media, and like what Lavinia has mentioned, that we have different safe spaces, and it's important that we get these voices so that people can participate safely, and but the problem comes when they get too comfortable, right? And they feel that, okay, there's this community space that really represents my views, and they start to be too comfortable to the extent where they kind of forget that there's this actual majority opinion, and this is just a majority opinion expressed in a particular, and there's also their own opinion, and it all gets so blurred because when they get so comfortable. And that's when we need all these kind of national conversations. But without them realizing, and without them being too comfortable, right, that they need to detach and know that there are a lot of other chambers, and I think a lot of other views. I think that is the dangers of social media in that sense, when humans get too comfortable. So before we pull them into the safe space, to a common space, we need to there are these instances that makes that kind of probe or even trigger them to think otherwise and not be too comfortable in their own spaces online. Yeah.
So one question, because we keep using the term safe space, one question is, who is a safe space for? Is it for those who are comfortable or those who are not comfortable? Hello, the seconds are ticking away. What is wrong with my esteemed colleagues?
Well, it should be for both, right? It really depends.
It's for everyone.
Yeah, it's for everyone, right?
Kind of who is uncomfortable and who's comfortable, right?
Right. So it's a space where we're not afraid to talk about difficult topics like race or religion, right? It's a space where you can say, oh, I don't know, but if I say I prefer this to this, does that mean I'm a racist? But I'm not, so, and then share that, opinion.
And that space itself, even though I'm comfortable to speak in that particular viewpoint, in that space, can become unsafe if it becomes very exclusionary, and it becomes extreme, where, it pulls people into one direction, and then misinformation starts to become the truth in these spaces because people attach their biases, people attach their meanings, and collectively create their own truth. Then that particular safe space can become unsafe itself.
Yeah, but I come back to Daniel's point, and that is, and also Lavania's, that the silent majority, so to speak, right, for lack of a better term, their voice is heard in the IPS surveys, for example.
Yes.
Right? When I suddenly had to become a race relations, at least, go back to race relations 101 and make sure I know my material before coming here. And the results are very consistent. Representative samples of Singaporeans, telling us that, this is a good place, right? That it embraces and what we stand for in terms of, a multicultural society. And generally, the news is good on that. But of course, we do acknowledge that there's no place on earth that is free from racism, sadly. So in the last few minutes, I would invite each of you to articulate your wish list. Moving forward, if you were going to drive Singapore to that nice, middle ground where we acknowledge that there are differences among different races. We acknowledge that sometimes we are curious about those differences. We acknowledge that there are those among us who would add value, right? To those value, notation to those differences. What can we do to ensure that we don't lose our safe, stable, middle ground? Elmi?
Well, quickly, I think it must be inclusive, I guess. I guess we mustn't forget that when we talk about, discourse or getting opinions or social media opinions or opinions from real people, from real life, because not everything on social media is real. Yeah, so I guess we must be inclusive in the sense that we mustn't forget that a lot of people do not participate in social media discussions, right? And we think that there's a lot of voices, that's amplified, but actually a lot of people do not comment. So we must first understand that, and I think you brought reference to IPS surveys that actually survey kind of actual public opinion on certain matters, and we must have a sense on how we're going to bring this group of people into the conversation.
So that we are cognizant of what they represent as well. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And on that part of inclusiveness, we also must check our language. Language in the sense that, like, whether the language is too sophisticated, and I really could understand where Syntax was coming from, in the sense that there was really kind of a misunderstanding or misconstruedness of when you talk, when loaded terms are used in race discourses, right?
Okay.
Okay, I'm not going to comment on what are
Okay, you
these
have
terms.
like 1 minute.
Yes.
Okay.
So basically, we must close the knowledge gap and not use too much of a loaded term.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a simple question. Thank
Daniel, 1 minute.
Well, there's a lot of call for more conversations, more safe spaces and everything. But I think the key thing that I think a lot of us have to learn is to listen. Yeah. So I think on my own part, I mean, it's something that I have to do in terms of going onto social media and just listening, right? Listening to all the different voices, telling stories of their own experiences, whether it's from the majority or from minority. But especially for me, because I'm from the ethnic majority, I would want to listen to the stories from the ethnic minorities to understand their world, their experiences. I think listening is very important.
I think that's a very good takeaway. Yeah. Lavanya?
So I think just to reiterate what I said before about institutions, right? My wish and hope is that we have strong institutional support for ensuring equality and upholding multiracialism, and a willingness to be uncomfortable, right? Because this might result in discomfort for a lot of us in confronting opinions and people who we might not necessarily confront or have dealings with. But this is part of growth, right? Part of what we want to achieve. So I think my wish is for more institutional support and to be more comfortable with discomfort.
Let me try to put it in another way. If a family has some tension and then they decided to go for family counseling, the counselor will then tell them, the first and foremost, the most important thing is to have open communication. But you have to express your honest feeling to one another. Then I'm sure the family counselor will then remind them, but when you share your feeling, try not to use sweeping statement. Try not to use like, you always like that, you never do this, and things like that, I think when we start off with our national conversation on race issue, let's remember what the family counselor talked about: open communication.
I just smile when I hear that. It's like old-fashioned wisdom, because sometimes we are so quick to jump and so quick, because we want to squeeze in our 10 seconds worth of opinion. We use strong words and we use, very fleeting analogies and truths, that are not quite substantiated. So I thank RSIS and IPS for allowing us to come together today. Thank you, our audience, for being so patient with us. The fault is all mine if I didn't read out your questions, but I must say this tablet not so easy, okay? And I learned a lot personally, and I learned that from this session, if we pause, take the time to listen and to understand each other's perspective, there is always something that we can learn from each other. So Singapore is a very precious place for all of us. It is our home, and it embodies, what multiculturalism stands for. I don't think there is another place in the world where I'm more comfortable than when I am in Singapore. So please, let's all play our part to continue to keep our country a safe place, and to remember that all of us are stakeholders, and this is, something that you want to claim and that we want to claim together. Thank you very much, and thank you, my friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Straughan and our panelists for the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the forum. On behalf of IPS and RSIS, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to all the speakers and moderators today for their time. Thank you also to the audience for your active participation in the discussions. I hope that these are conversations that we will continue having after today. Ladies and gentlemen, before you leave, please take a few minutes to complete our feedback form, which will appear on the screen shortly. Your feedback will go a long way in helping us improve our programs. Please be reminded that this forum has been recorded and will be available on the IPS webpage and YouTube. Thank you very much again for joining us today, and have a good evening.